Hi, Nick.
Oh, sorry, I don't have the ability to hear at the same
Yeah,
time.
no problem. I've actually got your time for your Q&A for just like 15 minutes from now, but I'm going to try and move it up, okay?
Okay, if you can't, that's fine. I have no time restrictions here, so.
Okay, I'll try and move it up, and you just have to watch the chat section here, and we'll see if the
Okay,
questions start populating.
sounds good. I'll open it. Okay, great. Can I hear myself now? I don't know that I can. I didn't like that, huh? Yeah, I don't think I can hear myself. Oh, great way to test this. All right. Well, I thank you all very much for attending. I hope you can hear me okay. I'm trying to use two different systems here for audio and microphone. I'm going to be looking back and forth. I've got my computer with the chat open right here. Two things that I wanted to quickly show you all that we didn't have time for in the tour. And before I get started, someone please punch me in the face if I say ultimately one more time. Apparently that was my favorite word the days we were recording. I just wanted to show off, we've got a model here of the Proton rocket because I didn't get the chance to go more into depth into Proton or the LK-700 moon lander. So this is what the Proton configuration, one of the Proton configurations looks like. You can just barely see down at the bottom here. It's got a lot of boosters that are surrounding its central core, and then the entire central core drops off as it gets progressively up into higher stages. One thing that's a bit interesting about the LK-700, which was the alternate to the LK moon lander, was The LK-700 would have used a really interesting clustered configuration of boosters and tanks to get itself down to the moon. So, for example, while Apollo was looking at doing the direct descent mode for getting to the moon, that configuration would have included a very tall spacecraft. One spacecraft to go from Earth, land on the moon, lift off from the moon, and bring the astronauts back home. Whereas the LK would have been a squat but sort of wider spacecraft, which I think is interesting. Something else I just want to point out is this model right here. Now this looks a lot like the International Space Station, but this is actually a model of Space Station Freedom. The stuff that I focused on was primarily stuff that happened in the 1970s, so I didn't include Space Station Freedom. But Space Station Freedom was proposed by the Reagan administration to be sort of NASA's new big effort after NASA had the space shuttle for several years, but hadn't done anything with it that was, well, there was no one big thing that NASA could point to. I think it's really interesting, being an American, the way that individual presidential administrations, for lack of a better term, kind of yank NASA around. It tends to happen with most of them, and in some ways it's a bit of a miracle that the current administration as well as the previous one have both had the same plan. That blows my mind a bit. But Reagan came up with Space Station Freedom as his administration's big plan for NASA, and then Space Station Freedom continued nominally for parts of H.W. Bush's presidency, but ultimately was given so little funding in Congress that it was sort of de facto defunded. Of course, the design is familiar, and the reasoning for that is that this design would be the basis for the International Space Station, the central truss with 2 sets of solar arrays on each side. Space Station Freedom has some different configurations, but this is roughly it, and with the living modules here in the center. I just think it's interesting to see how similar it was, and also interesting to see with this model that was made in the 1980s, this hypothetical future shuttlecraft that's on approach to the station. I always like the sort of government fill crafts that are put in. One other thing before I start answering the questions, before I forget, I want to do 2 real quick shout outs. One of them is I want to shout out again Element 115 Art. Under that name on ArtStation, Instagram, and Twitter. They lent the use of the Venus flyby renders, and they have a ton of fantastic stuff showing all kinds of different hypothetical, like Soviet and American Apollo-Soyuz 2 that's a circumlunar flight, or what if the command module had been converted for Earth orbital use to carry payloads, as well as more out there stuff like making versions of Star Wars ships that look like they belong to our world. The TIE bomber, for example, as a Soviet space station. So I'd highly recommend you check out their art. It's fantastic. I also would be remiss if I did not draw a quick note to Paul Dry and his book, as well as WordPress blog, False Steps. You can find it under either of those names. Paul Dry basically gives the long version of this talk, which is he has a WordPress blog as well as a published book about space plans that never happened. His book and his research was invaluable in putting together this talk, and I have to call him out as a major contributor. So, okay, I'll ultimately, let me see, I can go to, oh, there we go, ultimately. That one I read because Ed put it in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and blame him for that one. So the presentation is not scripted. I do this from memory. I mean, usually we do a couple run-throughs, so my wording is roughly the same on most of the takes that we do, but it's not scripted. With last year's tour, which was just a tour of our Hall of Space gallery, I was able to draw on the space tour that I have going in my head anytime I take guests through there. So I think the language in last year's was a bit more refined and a bit more varied, but ultimately I'm pretty pleased. In the end, I'm pretty pleased with the results here. Yeah, so someone asked about my educational background. So I went to Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU in Richmond, Virginia. I have 2 degrees from there. I have one in cinema, which was a practical filmmaking kind of degree, and then I have one in public relations. I don't work in either of those fields at the Cosmosphere. We do have public relations. We don't have an explicit cinema department. But when I was a kid, we visited the Cosmosphere once. My family did on a cross-country trip, and then the next 4 summers I was at summer camps here because of how much I loved this place. And then I came back as a counselor for several summers. And when the Cosmosphere opened for full-time positions in 2021, I moved across the country just to work here. So it's where I am right now. I think at some point in the near future, I'm aiming to go back to school for aerospace engineering at Wichita State University. I am taking classes in that right now at the community college, and I'm also working on my pilot's degree, so I'm pretty close to that. Does the Cosmosphere have... Oh, does the Cosmosphere have many books in its store? So actually, I buy books from the Cosmosphere store quite a bit because they're for employees. There's a healthy discount, and our gift store manager just got in a whole bunch of new books that I don't have and haven't read. My problem is I have this long list of space history books, and it gets longer faster than I read them. But yeah, the Cosmosphere does have quite a few excellent space history books. Paul Dry's book, False Steps, The Space Race as It Might Have Been, that one is available on, I can't remember the platform. It's a non-DRM platform, so you can buy it as a digital book and you can read it in any format. You know, it's not like if you buy it from Kindle where you can only read it on Kindle. We don't have that one in physical press. I don't think it's ever had an actual physical printing. But as for, I mean, I'm trying to think what would be the most contributing books that I've read. Well, I did a shout out to Patrick Brennan's Island of Clouds, which is part of a larger series called Altered Space. That's about different space missions if they came to be. So I think he has Apollo 13 landing on the moon, Yuri Gagarin on a circumlunar Zond flight, the Venus flyby. He's got a book about the Mall station, and then one about a Soviet lunar landing. And if you like space missions that never happened, those are fun and interesting fiction, particularly because the crews are real. For example, the Venus flyby crew is Commander Alan Shepard, senior pilot Buzz Aldrin, and junior pilot Joe Kerwin, which is an interesting mix of personalities. So I'd recommend those. As for other space history missions that never happened, one book that I'm looking forward to that I haven't yet read is called After Apollo. It's a political history of Nixon post-Apollo 11 mission planning. I haven't quite gotten to that one, which is funny because I just gave this talk. Also, I just finished reading Teasel Muir Harmony's Operation Moonglow, which was a political history of NASA and the American government's use of space for the space race, basically from Sputnik to Apollo 11. That was a fascinating read, and that gave a lot of insight into the way that different administrations saw and used value of space and NASA. I'd highly recommend that one. So if anyone has any other questions, by all means, please go ahead and put them in. There's unfortunately a couple things I still didn't end up talking about because we didn't have artifacts for them or just didn't have time to film them. We were actually low enough on time that the outdoor portion we filmed with our Titan rocket. We filmed that as I was on my way out of the door to get to an appointment to have a wisdom tooth pulled, and that was the last filming we were able to do. So we kind of got a bit down to the wire there. Okay, Ed asks, oh yes, what are the VR headsets for? I said I would answer that. Ed, I'll get to your question in a second. So the VR headsets, we've used them for different games over the years, but we've been developing a game that we're really, really excited about. It's called Untethered. It's being developed in conjunction with funding from K-State University and an actual VR game company. The premise of the game is it's based in part off of, and I'm forgetting the specific space shuttle flight here. It's based in part off a flight that Dr. Tom Jones was part of. He and another spacewalker were repairing a coolant feed line on the outside of the International Space Station when they got coolant on their suits. And so they had to wait outside on structure for the coolant to dry off. And then once they got inside, they had to carefully towel themselves off. So this game kind of takes that a step further. It's brief. It's not super long. It's made to be played in a session so that we can use it in our camps in like 40 to 90-minute session, depending on how much of the game you do. But anyways, you go out on a spacewalk on the ISS to repair a coolant line. While trying to turn a valve, the torque is too much, and you get thrown off station and you have to use the simplified aid for EVA rescue, the safer emergency spacewalking backpack edition to get yourself back to station. And everything's made to be as accurate as possible. So for example, if you've ever seen images of the MMU has 2 separate hand controllers, one for translation, up, down, forward, back, left, right, and one for rotation, roll, pitch, and yaw. Safer is a stripped down version of the MMU, basically. So it has 1 controller, and you have to switch back and forth between translation and rotation. So you have to be very deliberate with your movements because you also have a very small amount of fuel. So that's the primary use of the VR headsets for most of our camps at this point. The game is narrated by retired astronaut Dan Tani, who's a friend of the Cosmosphere, and he provides his voice to the training sessions. There's also a separate mode where you get to walk through a maze while being watched over by some mice on a floating platform. We have someone here who's a big fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So that's the primary use of our VR headsets. Okay, so Ed asks, is there any specific space mission or vehicle that you feel is worthy of a very focused presentation that is not well known? Well, okay, so I would feel that the things that would be most worthy of a focused presentation would be things that were sufficiently developed to warrant that kind of treatment. Of course, something that's really neat about space history is that when you get into it, there's so many different nooks and crannies to peer into that you kind of never run out of things to learn. And that's true with any large historical undertaking or period of time. That's not specific to space history. But even underdeveloped programs will have a lot of interesting information. Of course, at that point, you may or may not be interested in learning, about the meeting where they decided to go down from 200 to 100 rivets on a particular piece of hardware. When you peer under enough rocks, the returns from what you're finding out of the rocks do tend to become smaller, if you take my meaning. I think one thing that I would love to see a long-form presentation on would be just the Soviet space effort to the moon. It's a large topic. You have a lot that's encapsulated in there, but given that the space race ended up being focused on going to and landing on the moon, and given that the Americans were publicly trying to do that and the Soviets were privately trying to pursue that, there's a lot of history there that's really fascinating. I also think the exploration of that is particularly interesting given that information on the Soviet space lunar efforts did not become readily and widely available until the 90s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when things were becoming declassified. There was no confirmed Soviet lunar program until that point. And so I think that adds an extra layer of intrigue to it because it's still relatively new as far as information goes, especially compared to Apollo. So, a long-form presentation on the N-1 rocket, on the infighting between OKB-1 and OKB-52 and between Korolev and Chertok and, oh, you'll have to forgive me, I'm blanking on his name. It's going to come to me either in a few seconds or a few days. Glushko, who designed engines. So exploring those things, exploring the hardware of the different variants of the Soyuz or the LK moon lander, exploring the cosmonaut training, because Alexei Leonov later stated that him and other cosmonauts were going through circumlunar and lunar landing training. There's a lot of different stuff to do there. And when I originally started this talk, I actually planned a little bit of a larger role for the Soviet lunar landings. I have a model from Fantastic Plastic. They're a resin model maker of the LK moonlander that I've never assembled, and I got really gung-ho about doing it, but I was reminded that it's still a little bit above my skills, so that didn't end up coming to be. So, okay. Okay, Bob Sanford asks, are there any NOVA rocket artifacts at the Cosmosphere? Excellent question, and NOVA was something that I originally put on the talk, but I disregarded because I didn't have any good artifacts for it. For anyone who doesn't know, NOVA was a gigantic, truly, truly massive rocket that was considered for direct descent Apollo mode. So no separate lunar orbiter and lunar lander, just one huge spacecraft that would have gone to the moon, landed on the moon, and come back to Earth. Nova as a booster, if I recall, would have required 8 F1 engines, and it was several orders larger than the Saturn V. It's really quite amazing to see it. Also, funny enough, if you look at Saturn V compared to the Soviet N1 rocket, they look very different, but Nova compared to the N1 rocket has a lot of similarities. It doesn't have the smooth, straight down lines of the Saturn V. Like the N1, it kind of is an elongated cone, which I always thought was neat. Okay, Mark McReynolds drew attention to Lunar Gemini, which is also a good one. I actually didn't know about that one until I read about it in Paul Dry's False Steps book. Yeah, Lunar Gemini is really cool. Again, that idea of McDonnell saying, "Hey, wait, we've got a really reliable spacecraft here. Don't you want to use it for more stuff?" Which I've always thought was really funny. Okay, Steve Kranish says that cross range for the shuttle was about 1K miles to return to the launch point. My understanding of that is not different, and I mean, if you've taken a class on it, I would trust you over that. If I said something to the contrary, I do apologize. The main thing I know is that the DC-3's cross range was far less capable than the shuttle's, so it couldn't have returned to a lot of points. But I do always find that really fascinating, that so much of the shuttle was dictated by military requirements, and it's just a lesser known portion of shuttle history that was how the shuttle came to be. Okay, Vince asks, for all the paths not taken, what would have been the next best alternative step for space exploration? Man, I hope you can tell me. I mean, it's impossible to say for sure what it would have been. I've long been of the opinion that had NASA, specifically under James Webb, been able to get a moon base into existence before the early 1970s, had it been sort of, say, early Apollos to scout out a landing site and then moon base, that things would have turned out very differently. Because you look at something like, let's take the ISS, well, this is Freedom, but let's take the ISS compared to the Space Shuttle. The Space Shuttle was something that a presidential administration was able to end because you can stop flying it each time it comes back to Earth. There doesn't have to be another mission. Whereas something like the ISS, I think, has survived so long in part because no one wants to drop the ball and abandon something. No one wants to be the president that took us out of something. I've long had a theory that if a lunar base had managed to squeak in before NASA's funding was, completely slashed, and before the Nixon admin really parsed things down to just the space shuttle, I think that lunar exploration would have had to continue, because Nixon wouldn't have wanted to be the president to abandon a moon base. That would look horrible. So that's my personal opinion as far as paths not taken that would have led to a different outcome. Aside from that, I also think that if NASA had decided not to go with the space shuttle and instead to focus on upgrading and expanding Apollo hardware, I think that could have led potentially to a different outcome. For example, if the Saturn V production plant was able to be restarted, even if just to put out one rocket every couple years, building on that wealth of technology would have, I'm sure, produced quite a different future than the one we got. As I said at the end of my talk, I don't mean to sound sour about the space shuttle. I grew up with the space shuttle. It is my spacecraft from my childhood. I recognize its flaws while also appreciating it for what it was. But I think space exploration likely would have continued further if different paths had been taken. Yeah. Okay. Ed, do you want to mention anything about future museum acquisitions? Oh, yes. Ed's very good at prodding me along. So something we are excited about is recently we've entered into an agreement with SpaceX to acquire a Raptor engine. Now, there's a big asterisk on the end of that, which is that we're doing a lot of renovations right now. And as far as I'm aware, at the end of those renovations, there will not be a place for the Raptor engine. I think it's going to go into storage for the time being, with the hope being to display it in the next couple of years. But we are very excited to acquire the Raptor. We're also really excited because with our current, for anyone who doesn't know, the Cosmosphere is, which I imagine is probably most of you, I work here. It's in my face all the time, but not for all of you. The Cosmosphere is undergoing museum renovations right here, right now, rather, primarily in this year. We started these renovations back almost a decade ago, and then we've been doing them slowly, but a NASA grant and other grants allowed us to really push to complete them. So our museum and everything in it is going to be completely overhauled within the span of the next several months. So we're putting some really neat stuff out on display that we have not had on display. For example, we have Deke Slayton's backup Apollo-Soyuz A7L suit, and that's going on display, even though we didn't previously have the room for it. We have a Soviet Orlan training suit with, they had their own version of the MMU. I'm blanking on what its name was. If anyone knows it, please drop it in the chat because I don't remember. But we have that suit with its Soviet MMU, and that's going on display. And our galleries are just going to receive, in general, updates to the content as displayed, updates to the graphics, which have become faded and also outdated. So it's a really exciting time, and our museum is going to be really, I think, first rate this time next year, especially if anyone's been to the Apollo Gallery at National Air and Space as is right now. The current plans will have it, on that same level of professional, clean, finished nature. I'm really, really excited for that. Okay, let's see. Okay, all right. Nicholas Otero rightly calls me out on, are we going to talk about Sea Dragon? I did not bring out Sea Dragon, unfortunately. I am a big Sea Dragon fan, if nothing else, because there's an absurdity to the design of one giant engine on one giant big dumb rocket and launching it from the ocean. I do love Sea Dragon. I don't know a huge amount about Sea Dragon. I would have had to research more to talk about it, but Sea Dragon's always a good one to bring up. All right. Am I enjoying, Ed asks if I'm enjoying the current season of For All Mankind. Yes, I am. I haven't actually finished it yet. I need to get going on it, but I'm a big fan of that show. Something interesting that I found out recently is the Pathfinder second generation, sorry, I'm gonna say some spoilers for All Mankind. Okay, the Pathfinder second generation space shuttle that shows up in season 2 is actually, from stuff I've seen only just a little bit, but from what I've been able to dig up, is an adaptation of an existing NASA sort of second gen shuttle design that had the same removing, that had the same design of removing the one vertical stabilizer and instead putting 2 vertical stabilizers on each wing. Although that design also had some canards on the front so that the front crew cabin could be used as an escape vessel. It's really quite interesting. Okay. And, oh, for anyone who doesn't know, For All Mankind is an alternate space history show. It's basically, the show takes the tack of what if Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of OKB-1, had not died in 1966. Other things would have had to change, I think, for the Soviets then to have a successful moon landing. And so the Soviets beat the US to a moon landing, and the space race never stops. It's a very good show. I very much enjoy it. Okay. What is the museum's principal source of funding, Ed says? We get a lot of our funding from, well, I mean, day-to-day operations provide us with that. Being that the Cosmosphere exists in Hutchinson, Kansas, which is a town of 40,000, so kind of middle of nowhere Kansas, which is already kind of middle of nowhere USA. Unfortunately, the reality of our existence is we're never going to get as much visitor flow as somewhere like National Air and Space or Kennedy Space Center or California Science Center, because we're not located to somewhere that people would otherwise be visiting. If people come to Hutchinson to visit the Cosmosphere, they're not coming here to visit the Cosmosphere and see XYZ, although we do have a pretty neat salt mine museum. So our visitorship does provide us with a good amount of cash flow, although that's not, it's only a part of our revenue streams. We also do a lot of work with our summer camps and our educational programs. Those are very big for us, being that I'm in the education department. That's a passion of mine. And then we rely a lot on donations and grants. Those sources of funding that maybe they'll happen, maybe they won't. We've been fortunate these past 2-ish years to be getting a lot of money from donations and grants. It's been probably the most money that we've gotten since back in the late 90s, which is when we really expanded the facility to what it is today. So that's where we're at. If anyone does have the chance to visit, I'd highly recommend you visit sometime in the fall, the winter, next spring, when we're done with our renovations. One thing I am going to plug, because I'd be remiss if I did not do so, is we do offer adult astronaut camps. It's only a couple $100 for a couple nights. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I think you can do 3 nights with hotel for, well, 3 nights without hotel for definitely under 500. I don't remember how much it is. But that information is available online. You can go to cosmo.org and find that info. In particular, we are hosting an adult astronaut camp this summer, which includes dinner and time spent with retired NASA astronaut John Harrington. Harrington flew once on the space shuttle, I want to say STS-116, but don't quote me on that, to the ISS. He did an assembly mission for one of the pieces of the station's central truss, and he's also the first Native American to fly to space. He's a really friendly guy. He's been here before. He was a real treat to have around, and he'll be here this summer along with a bunch of other activities at our adult astronaut camp. But also, if a group of people wanted to come here and do an adult astronaut camp, we schedule them as requested if we have the availability of staff. So if anyone's interested, I'd highly recommend it. And there's my final plug. Okay, so unless there are, well, I'm seeing one question in Q&A. Okay, unless there are any other, are there any plans to author any books of your own? Not at the moment. You can find, I don't remember the exact name of the graph. You can find that graph that has, on one axis, it's got the amount that a person knows about a subject, and on the other axis, it's got the amount that they feel like an authority on that subject. And the more you know, the less you feel like an authority, and that's where I'm at with space history. It is my personal passion, and I read a great deal about it in my spare time. I think Teasel Mere Harmonies was my 55th space history book since 2020. Isn't actually that large of a rate. I have a friend who reads like 100 books, but that's fine. So in any event, I don't have any plans to author a book because I don't have any formal training in the subject, and I don't think I currently know enough, maybe at some point in the future. And also, I would only want to write a book if I felt like there was something that had not been explored before. You know, I think the more I know about space history, the more I'm interested in books that have novel information or connections between different points of history. So it's fine and dandy to read a book that's a summary of the space race, and those books always contain at least, you know, something new I didn't know. But when I read a book like, say, Operation Moonglow, or I just recently read Digital Apollo about the Apollo computers specifically, or Lunar Outfitters about the spacesuits, those are the books that are most interesting to me because they explore a new piece of technology that I hadn't read a lot about before, or because, in the case of Operation Moonglow, they are able to take the space race and turn it in a new direction I hadn't seen before. They're able to put a novel perspective on things. I think that's what's most interesting, at least to me personally. And I wouldn't want to write something unless I felt like I had a novel connection or something new to write about. Does adult astronaut camp include adult beverages in the spacesuits? No, it does not. I do believe there's going to be at least one night of, can't remember if it's, I don't think we're doing wine in the planetarium, but I do think there's going to be at least one night of some light drinks. And oh, thank you for putting cosmo.org. I appreciate that. Yeah. I can see really quickly here. Cosmocamps.org. You just got to remember if it's Cosmo Camps or camps at cosmo.org. Yeah, so the current adult astronaut adventure we have is 4 days and 4 nights and includes hotel stay. So the price is more than a couple hundred. It's $1,000. But if you were arranging for your own hotel stay or were staying for less than 4 days and 4 nights, the price would drop. And Okay, would the Constellation program count as a program that never happened, even though it only tested once? That's an excellent question. Constellation was originally on my outline for this because I think Constellation, given Artemis and the technology included in Artemis, I think Constellation is interesting and is worth mentioning. I also think there's something delightfully absurd about saying, let's take a space shuttle solid rocket booster and give it a second stage and put a crew capsule on top. That's always been really funny to me. Anyways, Constellation, I would say absolutely counts. Yeah, because it was a program that was developed and technology was made and tested to some degree, like, for example, the J2X engine, which would have been included on, I think, the Ares 5 rocket, but ultimately, didn't come to pass like the rest. But, Orion survives. Rocket designs created in Constellation have become SLS. It's a neat one to look up, if nothing else, for its ties to the current program. I thank you all for your great questions. I really enjoy talking about space history, and I'm sure you all, as space and rocket fans, can relate. There's an element to which I often, when I'm talking to people who are not interested in this world like I am, I kind of have to tamp myself down. I kind of try and keep stories brief and interesting, recognizing that people only have so much patience for this kind of stuff if they're not into it. And I never want to overstay my welcome. So I appreciate you all asking me questions. This is always a treat for me when I get to talk to about this stuff to an interested audience. If anyone has any other questions, you can drop them there. But otherwise, I think we're about good. Although, one thing I got to mention, I mentioned this to Ed just because I'm really excited about it. One of the things that we got with the new amount of money we just got in was a large-scale embroidery machine. We're hoping to be able to make custom patches for our camps. So in our camps, we have a spacecraft simulator. It's based on Orion, although it has some modifications to accommodate certain camp needs. It's based on Orion. It also has a space station module and an Altair lander. That's from Constellation. To allow for different mission profiles, Earth orbit, ISS, lunar orbiter landing, and Mars orbiter landing. So when I just got to restart to install the newest Windows. No, I don't want to do that right now. When we have our camps, campers get to go and do a simulator mission. And the point is we're hoping to ultimately be able to give each simulator mission team a custom patch with their names on it. There's a lot of logistical hurdles, but we've been doing it right now, and I'm really passionate about that. And those kinds of special extra things that add just that extra little touch. That's what we try and do here with our camps. Well, okay. I think that's just about it. Nicholas Ateros, how often do you think it will take? How long do you think it will take us to go to Mars? No idea. Hopefully it's within a decade or two, but it's been within a decade or two for the last several decades, so who knows? Hopefully soon. Either way, thank you all so much for the kind words. I really appreciated it. I really appreciate it. I appreciate you watching. I hope you all get the chance to come out to the Cosmosphere sometime soon. We have a lot of neat stuff to see, so please come visit us, and thank you for watching the presentation.